Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar, this lunchtime webinar. I'm John Stokes from the Tree Council. Thank you for joining us. There will be a little bit of padding, I think is the professional word that you use at this moment, just while you're all arriving, but and then I'll introduce my colleagues. But you know how it is with webinars, it's always good to know where you're all from. So at the bottom there is two boxes. One is a Q&A box button, which is for asking Q&A questions, and the other is for chat. So in the chat, exactly, Matt, you can just say where you're from, and it's hello, Matt. And if anybody else wants to put where they're from or who they were from, please stick it in the chat, and we can then say hello just while you're all arriving. There was an awful lot of you that said they were coming. So hi, Jodie in Yorkshire. And James in Herefordshire, hello James, and John from Wirral, and Jamie, hello Jamie, how are you? And James and Richard, and suddenly it's all around the country, from Severn Trent, from Warwick Hills, from Southwest Lakes, and in Devon we have people from all over the country, and Reading tree wardens, and hi Rich, and then there's Sarah from South Wales, and so it grows. We have a few more that we're expecting, so we're just going to give it another minute just to see. But while we're doing that, I'd like to introduce my two colleagues. I am joined today by Charlotte Benham, who works in our science and research team and has been leading on all of the ash dieback toolkit that you're going to hear about in a second. It's become one of her specialties over the last few years. And Ian Turner, who is in our operations team, but also leads our work in knowledge and data. And Ian is also a specialist on ash dieback, has been spending the last few years prior to joining us working in the Mendips on ash and ash dieback. And I'm John Stokes. I'm Director of Tree Science and Research here at the Tree Council. Thank you for joining us. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about our hedgerow trees and all about living with ash dieback. I think most of you look like you're here now, so we shall commence. And I've just got to make sure I get this right by sharing the right screen, which is always the bit that goes wrong. Can you see that, Ian, Charlotte?
Absolutely, yeah.
Good. So thank you for joining us all, everybody, and we're going to do a bit of a canter through the future of hedgerow trees and living with ash dieback. And just in case any of you aren't aware of who the Tree Council are, or you're new to Tree Council, we are a national charity that works together to deliver these four aspects. We work with the community, people like tree wardens in our community action, and I know many of you might be tree wardens today. We aspire the next generation of young environmentalists with our education and Young Tree Champions programme. We use science to influence policy and support best practice on trees and the environment with government and academic support. And partnership underlies all that we do. Our position is that we're the sort of umbrella across the charity tree sector, working with over 100 different organisations to try and do the best for particularly trees outside woods. And in that trees outside woods space, one of the most important is our hedgerow trees. And that's what we're going to talk to you about today. Our hedgerow trees define many landscapes across the country. They define the countryside. You can have a small number of trees that influence very large areas of countryside. They are an absolutely vital part of Britain's landscape. They're there as a result of history and tradition and the way that the landscape is created, but that has led to this really rich national coverage of trees in our hedges. Our hedges actually started an extraordinarily long time ago. We don't always think about when hedges started in landscapes, and these are the earliest field systems in the country. This is in Zena in Cornwall, and these are what are known as Cornish hedges. Cornish hedges are stone walls with trees and vegetation growing in them, but these Cornish hedges down in Zena were created about 4,000 years ago. So it is a very long tradition of having a hedgerow, a line of boundary vegetation around field systems. And we're even supporting a PhD this year looking at Cornish hedges And Abs, who's the researcher, is one of the most passionate advocates I've heard for a very long time about the importance of the Cornish hedge as a landscape feature. Our hedgerow tree relationship then changed as the Romans arrived. We started to see those hedges as more functional things. We started to give them purpose. They were in gardens, obviously like this in Chichester, but they also used the trees more. So they planted crop trees, they planted trees, and they started to manage those hedgerow trees as a wood supply. There's a very nice French phrase that is used about the French hedgerows, and they call the bocage, which is what's known as the French hedgerow, the French hedgerows are known by, as le forêt de paysan, the peasant's forest. And the Romans started this concept of using the hedge as a way of producing wood material from our hedgerows and our trees. And this is an area of Suffolk with many modern fields. You can see all the big large fields, but buried in the centre here is some of the oldest living hedgerows in the country. These are anything up to a couple of thousand years old. They're called rectilinear field systems. And these little tiny rectilinear field systems have been in the landscape for potentially thousands of years. And what we've not always understood is that those hedgerows have become, and the trees that are with them, have often become fossilized in people's gardens and at the backs of streets and across our towns and cities. So the importance of the hedgerow tree is vital in all our landscapes. And I count these lovely big hawthorns here as hedgerow trees because they are taller than the structure, they are having flowers, they are adding to that enormous biodiversity that hedgerow trees bring. Now, hedges themselves are Britain's largest nature reserve. And there's some facts and figures here. You don't need to know all of them, but well, I don't need to tell you all of them because you can see them later if you want to. But the hedges and the trees contain a vital amount of biodiversity. And some of our hedgerow trees are some of the rarest. This is a Plymouth pear in the top right there, which is the one tree in Britain that's legally protected. It's a very rare species, and it is almost entirely found in old hedgerows in Devon and Cornwall. And that makes some of the biodiversity of the trees in our hedges absolutely vital to the nation's ecology. And so those hedgerow trees are structurally important, biodiversity important, and they act as effectively as like service stations on motorways for insects traveling across the landscape, hopping tree to tree. And here we can see one of my favorite hedges in the country, actually. This is just outside Newmarket, and is made to look like a jump on the race course. But the hedgerow trees are prevalent in that hedge and look extremely nice. And indeed, the ash is prevalent in this hedge. And we have had a bit of a shifting baseline over the last 10 or 12 years. We've slightly forgotten what a really healthy ash looks like. And this is two examples of the great beauty of the hedgerow tree ash. I know the one on the left isn't technically a hedgerow, but I couldn't find a nice one that looked good for this morning. But what you can see is a big dome-shaped tree that provides enormous habitat opportunities for insects and wildlife across the country. And ash is a very common tree. It's across large quantities of the country, and this is a distribution map showing the sort of intense areas of colour where the ash is most prevalent. And it's an abundant species across the country with a huge biodiversity importance, which is largely lichen. Of the over 1,000 species that are known to occur on ash, lichen is possibly the most important. And there's one tree in Dorset by the side of the road, one hedgerow tree, which I refer to there on the left, which has over 45 species of lichen just in the first 2 meters of its trunk. Ash has a bark chemistry and a leaf chemistry that also influences the other things that grow around it. And often you see ramsons, the wild garlic, which is obviously up at the moment around our ash trees, both in hedges and in the woods. Unfortunately, the last 50 years has meant that changes to agricultural practice have often removed the hedgerow trees from landscapes just by the use of things like the flail, which has nipped the top off newly growing trees and stopped them from developing into the next generation. And the state of our hedgerow tree network across the country is a bit under threat. And this was data that was produced, and it looks old, but there is no more current data. This shows the current state of our hedgerow trees as it was back in 2000, and it probably hasn't changed, except that they're 25 years older now. But what happened then was that this was the curve of the hedgerow tree population. You can see there were very few young ones, an awful lot of 60, now 80-plus-year-old trees, and a declining number of older ones, 135 now it would be year-old trees. Back in the 1950s, a committee set the curve, the distribution curve that should exist for hedgerow trees, and you can see a complete mismatch between where it is and where it should be. They needed lots and lots of recruitment of young hedgerow trees, and this is the reality of the situation. So we need to recruit at least 30,000 new hedgerow trees to the landscape every year, just to keep our hedgerow tree population healthy. And then we had a bit of a curveball thrown at us, and a tree warden called Anne Edwards, back in I can't remember if it was 11 or 12, I think it was 12, made the discovery of the first signs of ash dieback in the country. And did that in a village which is possibly the most appropriately named village in Britain, because it's known as Ash Wellthorpe, but it rapidly became Ash Sickthorpe as the ash dieback started to spread across the parish, across the community. And across our landscape, ash is the commonest hedgerow tree. There are estimated to be over 61,000 miles of hedges where ash is the dominant feature. It's thought on average there's about one ash tree every 5 meters across the British Isles in our hedges. Not all mature trees, but lots of them growing within the structure of the hedge itself. And just to maintain the current population of ash trees, as I just said, we needed to plant 30,000, and that was before ash dieback. So as this week is National Plant Health Week, and that's an international movement to try and promote the importance of plant health, and particularly tree health in our case, we thought we would just unpack for you a little bit some of the guidance that's being produced about how we might get ash back into our landscape, and what that means if we do. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Ian, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the details of the biology of ash dieback, and then Charlotte will explain some of the information that we've been producing afterwards. So Ian, over to you.
Right. Thank you very much, John. Yeah, so what is ash dieback? You may have known it as cholera before, and you may also be aware of its effects, but it's a disease of ash, and it's caused by a fungus called Hymenopsipis vaccineus, and it arrived in the UK probably as early as 2004. And the fungus infects the crown and the stems of affected trees, causing death, or what we call necrosis, of the leaf and the stem tissue. And this is due to the actual invasion of that tissue from the fungal hyphae, which produce toxins. Initially, the identity of the fungus was made by it was made more complicated by the fact that actually we thought it was another Hymenopsipis species, which is Hymenopsipis albidus, which was a native to Europe. But what we found was actually that this wasn't the case, and that this was actually an invader from East Asia, which actually co-evolved with other ash native species in East Asia. But when brought to Europe, it was found that actually it was unable to, or at least it was toxic to the native species. It arrived probably around about in the 90s. It was in the Soviet or Eastern Bloc countries, but and following that, it was distributed around Eastern Europe and into Germany, and then from there to us. This image is actually of a rachis, or a part of the leaf, the midrib of an ash leaf, and is usually found in leaf litter. And these fruiting bodies are what produce the spores which infect trees. So the disease is actually spread by the wind, and the spores, or at least these bodies, do actually wait until the conditions are right, and then they spread the spores onwards to other trees. This bit of blackness that we can see is actually the fungus. It's protecting itself from drying out. So when you see a blackened leaf, or a blackened sort of part of a leaf that's on a forest floor, that's likely the infection. But it is that number of spores which is the problem, and it can spread through to the leaves in the autumn and also during the summer. So if we go to the next slide, we can see the actual infection, which we're probably more familiar with. You would have seen guidance from the Forestry Commission showing these images where we've got blackened leaves, and also there is some change to the stem too, with these diamond-shaped lesions around the bases of twigs or branches. So the main thing is that we need to be able to identify it, and also to report it where possible. But this is the infection, and what we would be looking at is where it actually is more common, and where it's more common and where it distributes itself more readily is through woodlands, and actually through wet conditions. So where it's rainy, or where there is a woodland, or particularly an area where there is more moisture. So go to the next slide. The distribution of this infection, or from the initial infections, has spread much more rapidly than we expected. This is the first map that was produced by the Forestry Commission, showing the first sightings, or where it was first identified. The following map, if you click on to the next one, is showing how it spread into 2017. And we can see that it's gone way across the country, right across even further into the north from those initial infection points. And then the last map in 2019, we've got, showing that it's well entrenched, and that it's distributed virtually all over the country. And now, obviously, the severity, the spread is not necessarily an indication of the severity of what you will be experiencing in your locality. But it does give an opportunity for us to actually respond with some increased inspections and some planning for what we can do with these trees that are infected. Next slide, please. So this is kind of, I suppose, a case in point for us about how human planning doesn't always work out. The map on the left is actually of a prediction of where the disease will be in 2017, all the way back in I think it must be 2012, 2013, as it says. And, on the right, what we have is actually where it got to. So we can see that it has spread much more rapidly. In fact, once the infections reach the landscape scale, the spread has been estimated to get to 30 to 70 kilometers per year, suggesting that some spores disperse aerially over very long distances. The far west infections that you saw in actually the initial slide seem to have been outliers, and you would have thought that would have been low risk, but in fact have resulted in quite a lot of infections, particularly in Wales. Next slide, please.
Right.
So we can see here's a cross section of ash wood, an ash tree that's been felled. And it shows that the infection has been present since 2003. And that's visible here in the growth rings. It's even declining right from that point on to the point where we can see that in 2007 and 8, it didn't actually produce a full growth ring. You can just about see that where John's indicating. The effect of the infection has been to cause decline and death, but it also causes the ash trees to have increasingly brittle stems and branchwood, which is due to the wood drying and the pathogens, what we call secondary pathogens, exploiting the tree's reduced health or vitality. We'll unpack that a bit later on in later slides. Next slide, please. So how do we know where it is? Well, we came up with some guidance back in 2019. And one of the key recommendations of this toolkit was the use of the 4-stage canopy assessment that we can see here. We can see the tree from the beginning, as John showed earlier on, a healthy tree, right through to the tree which is at the brink of actually dying. But this crown condition assessment is the best and fastest proxy indicator of tree health. Although this is a snapshot in time, it does indicate the level of infection. And then we can use this to assess it, both the public can use it and also professionals as a common reference point. Next slide, please. So what can we do? As we can see from this data, ash is an important tree species in many habitats and landscapes. With the removal of this key feature of the landscape, what can fill this space? The scale of the challenge posed to the current treescape and the extensive risk it imposes is now being grasped, but the extent to which the local authorities have been able to respond has varied due to the availability of guidance. I'll now hand you over to Charlotte, who's going to give us an update on the Ash Dieback Toolkit.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, John, as well, for providing that sort of context to what I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to give a very sort of whistle-stop tour of some of the updated guidance that we have produced, which kind of focuses on dealing with ash dieback. Now, we're aware of sort of the scale of the challenge, what can we do about it? And the toolkit does focus on ash dieback in a range of contexts, but I'm going to pull out some of those areas that are most relevant to hedgerow trees as well. Next slide, please, John. So yeah, as Ian mentioned, kind of the first guidance that we produced came out in 2019 in response to this growing awareness that ash dieback was going to be a very significant tree health issue that we needed to deal with, and we needed to encourage sort of a strategic approach to managing this very significant issue. And as part of that toolkit, we produced this visualization of the stages of response to a tree health pest or disease, starting with the awareness or anticipation stage, moving through planning and assessment towards the action and response phase, and then finally thinking about adaptation and recovery from ash dieback. Next slide, please, John. So this was kind of where we were as a sector and as landowners and land managers back in 2019 when that first toolkit came out. The priorities really were raising awareness, raising an understanding of what this disease was and the impacts that it was going to have, and then focusing on that planning aspect. What were the sort of strategic approaches that we could take to ensure the most effective response? Next slide, please. And then this is where we are now. Most landowners, land managers have moved through those earlier stages to really be focusing on the actions that they're taking and also thinking about how our treescapes can recover from the loss of ash trees. So kind of to reflect this change in the circumstances and the scenario that we were in with ash dieback, we felt that it was a pertinent time to produce updated guidance that was more focused on these later stages, thinking about action and recovery, and also reflected kind of the updates to the scientific understanding that we've gained over this period of time. So we created the updated toolkit, which reflected this increase in knowledge and kind of some of the information that we'd gathered about best practice. And so one of the areas we updated was the technical information, which includes scientific knowledge and some of the more detailed areas about the sort of ecology and biology of ash dieback as a disease. And I just wanted to pull out this focus because it was particularly relevant to hedgerow trees. And one of the things we have noticed is over the time that ash dieback has been progressing that not all ash trees respond to the disease in the same way. And there are multiple factors that's kind of come to light that can influence this. So climatic factors, as Ian mentioned earlier. And this can be seen in ash trees in different landscape contexts, responding differently to ash dieback disease. And this is particularly relevant as we're discussing hedgerow ash trees, which might be, well, there's some evidence to suggest that they might be less susceptible or progress through the stages of ash dieback disease more slowly, because where this crown density is lower in a hedgerow, the conditions are less damp, and they might be drier, and they also might be hotter, which then reduces the scale of the disease progression. And this is some evidence that's come out of European studies, so we don't know for sure that this is going to be replicated in British ash trees, but that's kind of an interesting area of research to look into. And then the other factors that can influence disease progression is this genetic component. So there's increasing evidence that there are multiple genes that are responsible for resilience and tolerance of ash dieback, and that this tolerance is heritable. So that's really encouraging news for us, that we could have next generations of ash trees that are more tolerant of ash dieback. Next slide, please. So the next section in the toolkit is that focus on taking action that we saw in the diagram earlier. So we've kind of broken this down into different actions that landowners and land managers might need to be taking to deal effectively with ash dieback. And this covers a real range of different areas that might need focus. Next slide, please. So this is an example of one of the actions, action 4 in our list, thinking about trees on the highway and public rights of way. This is just to give a bit of a flavour of what the sections on those different actions look like and the things that are included. And I've chosen this one to pull out because obviously our hedgerow ash trees are commonly along the highway or along footpaths. So that section, it includes a summary of some recommendations from the DEFRA report on ash dieback road closures, with some practical advice that they gave, such as coordinating approaches on large projects to minimise road closures, and information about highway survey regimes, which we also include in the toolkit, some findings from a workshop that we ran with FERA, and then also a case study from one of our local authorities about communicating with the public around ash dieback works. And so one of the other actions that we include in the toolkit is thinking about worker safety and considering that element when you're doing tree works. And I'm now going to hand over to Ian, who is going to discuss some of that guidance for tree workers in more detail.
Thanks, Charlotte. That's great. As you can see, there's guidance available for both creating response at a strategic level, but there's also guidance for workers. And Kaylee, I think, has put in the chat a link to the Ashworks for Scotland guidance. And this requirement for some more specific guidance for workers led to there being the Tree Council being commissioned to produce a supplementary guidance note for Ashworks in Scotland. And it's something that we produced on the basis that there was a guide needed for professionals and needed to be done both in consultation with professionals and contractors, so that we had all of that experience that had been, brought about, or at least had been gained from doing works in southern England, and could be taken north to where the ash dieback effects were being felt in a wave as it went up the country. Next slide, please. To ensure the guidance can be easily understood and applied by workers, the guidance itself takes a step-by-step approach, and it includes a clear sequence of checks that could be added to the normal pre-tree works assessments undertaken by tree workers, but it adds in the important factors and features and issues that may arise specifically from diseased ash. Next slide, please.
Brilliant.
That's all right. Thanks, John. The main problems caused to tree workers is the unpredictability of the affected trees. So assessing the stage of the disease will give an indication of the likely scale of these unpredictable factors. The key changes have been acknowledged to allow a plan to be made for work method changes. Next slide, please.
All right, my mouse is playing up in all sorts of technical meltdowns happening at this end.
You're doing well. This image shows the use of a spider lift or a mobile elevated work platform. This removes the need for a tree worker to climb the tree or to fell the tree from the ground in one, removing the risk of anchor point failure for a climber or the threat from falling debris and branches for somebody who's working on the ground. So it removes the branches before they can be a problem or it means that the worker is removed from that risk. This is still part of the planning of works, and an assessment needs to be made for the most optimal way to reduce the risks and undertake the works. As you can see, the guidance has provided some suggestions on amendments to working methods, such as the use of mutes, as we can see here, but the decision still lies with the professional and is important as just a prompt for them. Next slide, please. So we started with that logic. We used the logic that actually a tree worker will be approaching a tree and will want to use this guidance as they go through their day-to-day checks, so it can be applied on the ground and easily. And this uses the look up and look down method that is embedded in good working practice when approaching a tree. Next slide, please. Checking that all the measures have been taken, the worker starts working on the tree, and it's really important that these pre-checks are done, and it will allow for much safer working. I won't run through all of these particular ones, and if we could just go to the next slide, please. There are many considerations for the tree worker to take into account when working on ash. The felling of ash trees in hedges should be the last resort and only be the result of a thorough risk assessment and assessment of the risks posed by the tree. Alternatives such as retention, which could have heavily reducing the tree, or it could be leaving it as a standard, or dead wood. It is possible, but it will require the use of mutes and cranes. So any works need to be carefully considered, and obviously needs to tie in with any of the strategy or the monetary considerations, but these are options. But if undertaking felling, there are considerations outlined in the supplementary guidance for tree workers to reduce those risks posed. A link to that is in the chat, as I said. So whenever possible, retaining ash trees will aid the ecological resilience and landscape recovery, as Charlotte will now explain.
Oh, Charlotte, you're muted.
Thanks, Jill. Sorry about that. Thanks, Ian. Yeah, so as Ian said there, in some cases there is no choice but to carry out tree works, but really we do need to be considering scenarios where, if possible, we can retain ash in the landscape. And so thinking about the location of the tree, whether it's somewhere that's quite low risk, thinking about the stage of disease if it's early on in the stages in the categories. And if there are any sort of management approaches that would allow us to retain the tree, then we really need to be trying to do this where possible, because our ash trees are firstly really important for biodiversity. There are nearly 1,000 species associated with ash trees, and nearly 50 which are ash obligates, so they rely only on ash trees for things like habitat or feeding resources. We've got an example on the slide here of that click beetle. So to be able to continue supporting this biodiversity, we really need to keep our ash trees where we can. And alongside the biodiversity, it's really important that we keep as many ash trees as possible to maintain the genetic diversity in the population. As I mentioned earlier, there's strong evidence that there is some genetically controlled tolerance or resistance to ash dieback, so we need to keep as many of the parent trees as possible to produce that next generation of hopefully more tolerant ash trees. And that's not just in the context of ash dieback too. We need to maintain the genetic diversity in our ash population for future resilience too. There might be genes harbored in our ash population that provide resilience to climate change or make those trees better suited to surviving future pests and diseases. So where possible, we really need to maximise that population of ash trees that we still have for our future treescapes. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, one of the elements that we provide guidance on in the toolkit is how to plan and implement a recovery strategy which takes into account maximising retained ash numbers, but also understanding the impacts of ash loss on biodiversity when we do have to remove ash trees, and then thinking about what we can replant going forward to create a resilient treescape for the future. And I think John is going to talk now about how our hedgerow trees might change in those resilient treescapes of the future.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Charlotte. So the reality of the situation then for our ash tree population. And we're coming to a close in a minute, so it would be good to have your questions. So if you've got any questions you'd like to ask, do please put them in the chat. And I see quite a few of you have, but there was always space for a few more because we'd like to have a chat about this in a second. You can see in the foreground of this tree, sorry, of this picture, an ash tree that's still in good health. And as Charlotte's already said, it appears that hedgerow ash might be a little bit more protected from ash dieback because it's a bit drier, they're a bit more dispersed, they're a bit more protected from the infection just by their sort of separateness. But that absolutely isn't always the case. And look, we have in the same hedge just behind. So I've now walked down the road, taken the photograph in the other direction, and you can see that the ash tree behind is stone dead of ash dieback. That for me is the really interesting conundrum about this disease, that there really are some resilient, resistant trees here 50 yards apart in one hedge, and yet in other places, as here in Cornwall, all the ash trees have gone. And all the ash trees have gone in a relatively short period of time. So if we're to have that future generation of hedgerow trees, we need to be thinking about how we're going to cope, how we're going to manage, exactly as Charlotte said. And this applies not just to local authorities, to any of you that have a piece of land, you have some hedge trees on it, and you have that opportunity to do something. The question then comes, what are you going to do? So some research was done a few years ago about the alternative species that support the wildlife that lives in ash trees. And the green, orange and red here the red is not as bad as it looks. It's just not as good as the green. Any of these species have value for the species that live on ash. But they're quite interesting when you start looking at what that will mean, what that will do to a landscape. So oak is obviously a good potential species, as is beech, and so is sycamore, a tree that many people dislike, but in the future might become a really, really important part of our hedgerow tree population if you're wanting to support the variety of species. If you want the physical traits, then alders and aspens, but you know, they like it in the wetter ground, so they may not work in all places. If you're looking at the decomposition of the leaf litter, then alder, lime and rowan are good. The litter quality, walnuts, alders, lime, and alder and lime, and you start to stay across all of the traits. Alder, lime, sycamore all start to come out as really important potential replacement trees for ash in the right landscape, in the right soils, in the right places. And we're going to have to be thinking about that. Somebody's actually asked a question earlier about elms, and we can cover that later. But elm is was the main hedgerow tree. It got infected. It's died. It's standing there as dead often in the hedge. But the difference with elm over ash is that the elm actually didn't die. It just lost the top. The root system still lived. They produce suckers. The elms still come up. That isn't the case with the ash, which does die and vacate the space occupied. And of course, ash came in after the elm and filled up the spaces that the ash had, that the elm had produced. So our future hedgerow tree population is going to look different. Not necessarily bad, but definitely different. But we've got to put some more in, and they might be beeches. Beeches are great hedgerow trees. Particularly if you're in the south and west, if you're in Devon and Cornwall. Beech makes for a fantastic hedgerow tree and has many of the characteristics that you need for the landscape. Oak, as we said, biodiversity wise, but oak is a really good future generation hedgerow tree. But we might also have to get a bit creative with climate change coming. We might have to think about other things. Species that you don't see very often might start to come into play, but you have to think about the biodiversity. Yew is a great hedgerow tree, but it doesn't support anything like the wildlife. I think ash is yew is about 20 species, whereas ash is 1,000 species. So what do we want in our landscape? What species are we planting? What are we going to do? These are the questions that we need to be looking at and thinking about over the next 5 to 10 years. We also need to think about, in our urban areas, what should we plant? Do they have to be native trees? Do they need to be trees that are exactly biologically the same as our native ones? Well, it's an interesting question. We might go into it in a bit of detail later if you have some questions. But here, Norways have been planted in an urban hedge. Curiously, they have many of the similar characteristics of the bark that you might get on a sycamore, and therefore are particularly good for wildlife. That could have been a purple sycamore. If it had been a purple sycamore in an urban area, then it would have been a really good match for the biodiversity. So how are we going to make these decisions? What characteristics do we want? These are all the questions for the next few years. But fundamentally, as we saw earlier in the presentation, to get our hedgerow tree population back into good health, we have to plant anything up to 30,000 new hedgerow trees every year across the country. That's quite a task. And that was before ash dieback. So we think this is a fantastic opportunity for all of you to play your part, because this isn't a mass planting exercise of big blocks of trees. This is well placed, strategically important, ecologically critical trees across landscapes that will shape and mark the future mark the landscape for the future. And we have to do this together. We have to do this with the communities, we have to do this with the farmers, we have to do this with government, we have to do this with charities like ourselves. But that is the way that we are going to have a healthy hedgerow tree population. And to do that needs all of your support, it needs all of your effort to think about the opportunities that you can put in a new hedgerow tree. Anywhere where you can do it with the landowner's permission and the chance that it will survive, that's what we need to do over the next few years. And I have been a passionate advocate of hedgerow trees for the last 30 working years. But there probably has never been a moment when your efforts, your time, your thoughts are more vital than they are now to get more hedgerow trees back into the landscape. So as Charlotte said, we have lots of guidance and information on our website. The worker information that Ian's put up is there if you want it. There is lots of information about how to plan and structure your response to ash dieback if you're an organisation. And I know Kaylee's just posted links in the chat to some of our homeowner guidance and more individually based guidance. There's lots of information that we've produced, but if there's something we've missed, do let us know afterwards, because this is the sort of reason we do these workshops, so that we can get feedback from you on useful stuff that will help you going forward. So thank you all for listening, and what we're going to do now is we're going to tackle your questions. So I should just close this down. Let me see my colleagues, which is always helpful, so I can literally read the room, which is always a useful thing to do. And then we'll have a look at your questions. So Ian McQueen asked, he said that many of our local hedges have small and dead elm trees in them. Are these a problem for the hedges, and should they be removed? Ian, do you want to do that one?
The dead elm, no. I think sorry, do you want to change your screen?
Oh, sorry, I've forgotten to do that basic bit.
That's all right. It's just so you can see the pan list.
There you go.
So the question is, what should we do with the small dead elm? Is that I personally feel like it's an example of the contrast between ash dieback and elm, really, because the dead elm in your hedgerows, it takes many, many years to decay and to become an issue or to likely fail. It really depends on where it is as to whether you should remove it. If it's nowhere near people, then leave it, because it's a good source of deadwood for beetles. And, you know, deadwood is an essential component of hedgerow. And I would say that it has very little effect on the regrowth that does happen from the base of the tree of our English elm. It is essentially a functioning landscape feature. It is something that we need. We need what we call aerial deadwood. So it's something that dries out and stays dry. If it goes on the ground, it's a different habitat. And aerial deadwood is a fairly rare habitat that we need to encourage. So I would say if it's in the right place, it's not imposing much risk, then I would retain it. If it's adjacent to footpaths and it's big enough, i.e. above 15, 20 centimeters, then I would absolutely be worried that actually you need to do something in a certain time period. You don't need to remove it completely to the ground. You could cut it high and reduce the leverage on it. But otherwise, yes, retention is good. Don't worry about it. Otherwise, just be concerned about the risk imposed, but otherwise retain.
Thank you. Lots of questions now coming in, so we're going to have to go through these in sort of rapid order to try and get. Katie, there is hopefully some information we posted in the chat. I'm sorry, I'm not over the chat, but on how we can people with properties and how they can look after and protect their ash trees and work on them. And so hopefully that will or is there. Sue's asked a question: is there any signs of recovery in ash? And that's a really interesting question. Because there are signs of an individual tree occasionally showing a bit of better looking health for a few years. I mean, the trees literally outside my front door have been looking very healthy for the last 5 or 6 years, and they are still looking very healthy. They looked a bit worse before that, so they've come back. But as a general trend, once a tree starts to get particularly badly infected, it doesn't seem to make much of a recovery. The thing, however, is that we are seeing more trees out there that are showing signs of resistance than I'd hoped. Than I'd feared. There are definitely trees out there that are looking better and surviving when others have gone, and those are going to be the important ones.
Yeah, but it's an anecdotal thing, isn't it, John?
Exactly.
that actually there are stories of arborists and tree people who will say there are trees which are recovering, but as John says, is this something that's due to the season and the lack of infection due to dryness in that environment, or is it because they've been worked on and that they've removed all the infected parts? There's still work to be done in that space, and there is hope, but it's maybe not as scientific as at the moment as we would hope it could be. Requires more work.
Exactly. John Preston's asked, how confident are we that there will be resistant major ash trees in the future? Charlotte, do you want to do that one?
Yeah, I think that is a really good question. It's something obviously like a lot of us are worried about, and I think there is real potential. Work from people like the Living Ash Project, Future Trees Trust, people at Kew Gardens. There is a real focus on trying to figure out the genetic kind of components that are underlying that resistance. And I think there has been some really positive kind of findings in that space. There definitely is evidence that there is sort of polygenic resistance in trees, and I think that is kind of where our advice on retaining ash trees comes really important, because kind of our best natural opportunity to select for those resistant trees, while it might take a while, is leaving the trees that look the best and giving them the opportunity to then pass on that tolerance or that resistance to their offspring and produce that next generation. And hopefully kind of over time, as we get this process of natural selection occurring, that resistance will increase. And there does seem to be some evidence that those trees that are less susceptible to ash dieback are also producing a higher number of offspring. They're producing higher amounts of pollen and higher amounts of seed. So that's a very promising approach. And obviously with scientific or sort of technical intervention in that breeding process, we could speed up that sort of selective process and produce that next generation much quicker. So I think there is definitely real optimism around that sort of potential for resistant trees.
And there's a professor called James Brown who works for the John Innes Centre over in East Anglia, and it links to another of the questions that's been posed, who says that there is genuinely important work for us all to do. And John asked the question, is there a role for small-scale tree nurseries to collect and grow seed from locally resistant ash trees? And what Professor Brown over in East Anglia has said is that is absolutely vital to the future of our trees. And what he's articulated is that it's really, if we're starting to get trees that are left after the disease has been through an area and they are showing signs of resilience, then the seeds of those trees will carry some of that trait. And he said that everybody should be going out and collecting all of that seed from those local resistant trees and creating groves of ash trees. We will then expect that some of those trees will still die when the disease comes back, but the ones that survive that second impact in 20 years' time, when they start to seed, the reproduction of those that are still standing next time round will be really healthily, not healthy, completely healthy, but really much more resilient. So there is a fabulous 20-year project for small-scale tree nurseries to go out and collect lots of ash seedlings from resistant trees, particularly where the other trees in the area are gone, propagate those, spread them out, let those trees take the next hit, but the breeding of those trees will be particularly important to the landscape. So John, yes, there is a vital role for small-scale tree nurseries to do this, and it would be really good if people wanted to explore that. Jamie, hi Jamie, how are you? I asked a question about the real benefits in promoting education in planting non-native trees in light of climate change, especially where he and I both are here on the south coast. Ian, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, definitely we need to look across the board and increasing the diversity of our tree species in our, not just hedges, but across our urban areas and into field plantings as well. I feel like it's not just a species issue, it's a structure issue and an age issue. We've got lots of things we need to solve. I think, you know, particularly with reference to hedges, we should be more tolerant of other species that maybe we're not used to seeing. But I'm sure there are a palette of trees that would look relatively familiar, like we mentioned, non-native ash trees, you know, like Fraxinus ornus, or, you know, others that we could fill a kind of a niche, I think, within our hedgerows. But we can't just have, you know, natives. We can't just have, you know, even sometimes we need to look outside of what we're used to. I think John's images that he's put up, I think, illustrate the point very well, that actually, you know, even things like Norway maple may be something we could consider, although that has come with its downsides. I think that there, you know, we do have this potential to open up, you know, the countryside to, you know, be made more beautiful, and actually the kind of treescape to be much richer, I think, you know. So yes, I would consider maybe we need to have a list that people can look at for their benefits, and that's a bit of guidance that could be quite useful, I think.
Okay, so many questions and we're not going to manage to deal with them because we've only got 5 minutes left, folks, but we'll keep going until we've run out of time. Patricia says, have you seen significant negative impacts of wood boring beetles on ash dieback trees? I'm particularly interested in Agrillus, I'm going to get this one wrong, Convilecolis, which has recently arrived in the UK, but is already widespread. Have you surveyed its spread at all? And I'm afraid, Patricia, we haven't. I would be really interested to hear about that afterwards. So if you'd like to drop me an email with the details of what you're doing, what you've done, I would be genuinely interested in that. Send it to me at john.stokes@treecouncil.org.uk. I'd be really interested to see what you've done in that space. There are wood boring beetles that are impacting upon ash. One of them is actually extraordinarily rare at the moment. It's called the violet click beetle, and it's a species that has that lives in dying and dead ash, and there is a potential golden moment for violet click beetles over the next 5 or 6 years, when there will be lots of habitat for this particularly rare species. But of course it won't then last, because as the trees fall and decline and we don't get any more dead ones, that burgeoning. So if you want to see a violet click beetle, the next few years might be and I do, the next 5 years. And if anybody sees one, please let us know, because I want to see one. The next 5 or 6 years are going to be really important.
It's an argument for veteranization, isn't it, John? You know,
expand a bit.
So essentially, there's been a movement in the tree world towards understanding, you know, how we increase the richness of our habitats. And one of the habitats that has become rare is the kind of veteran trees. Veteran trees are trees which have particular features, like they've got open wounds, they're kind of declining trees, or they've got, you know, decay within them. And they provide very particular habitats for, you know, beetles, wood-boring insects, and kind of lots and lots of rich invertebrate habitats within these veteran tree species, the veteran trees. And we have not enough of them. So what has been the movement is to create these veteran trees by wounding and sort of, I think it was called by one of the tree people to be torturing trees, because actually what you're doing is you're cutting them open, making them more open to not diseases, but to fungi and decay, which would provide that habitat. So we need to think about how we can use these dying ash trees as that potential kind of source material for this, you know, veteranization. So by reducing trees heavily and by doing excessive works, or probably what we wouldn't call very good tree work, you're providing potentially a habitat for that violet click beetle, because what you're doing is by reducing it heavily, it probably won't survive. It will come back slightly, but it will decline and decay, and then, but it won't be a danger, but at least it'll be in the landscape and be a source of habitat.
We are approaching the last 2 minutes, so I'm just going to deal with 3 last questions. 2 from Anthony. Hi, Anthony. Long time no see. Those both are extremely good questions about the practical management of ash in dealing with contractors and dealing with bidirectional felling. The answers to all of those, directional felling. The answers to all of those are actually in the toolkit that Ian's referred to. Have a look at that. If you don't get the answers, you need to come back to us. And for our last question today, because we are almost hard up against time, there was a question, a very simple question from somebody, sorry, lost it, from Claire, who asked, is there a link to the replacement species paper? And yes, Claire, there is. I can't remember exactly the nature of the paper, but I do know it's cited in work. If you look up the Devon Ash Dieback Resilience Forum, they produce some lovely guidance with some help from us, one of which is all about the replacement trees for hedges in the event of ash dieback, and all of that information is contained within that paper. So Devon Ash Dieback Resilience Forum, hedgerow trees and ash dieback, and it's all there. And on that note, I'm going to draw things to a close for today. Thank you all for attending. Thank you particularly to Charlotte and Ian for all the work they've been doing to create these documents and for talking about them today. As well as being National Plant Health Week this week, which is why this one was on ash dieback, it's also Tree Council's and the industry's own National Hedgerow Week. And tomorrow, we have another hedgerow webinar, which is all about the future of hedgerows, with some of the finest speakers and minds in the business who are going to be talking tomorrow about their views of the future of hedgerows. They are all part of a committee called HedgeLink, which I have the absolute privilege of chairing for the last decade. They are some of the best speakers you'll ever hear. If you have a chance and you're around tomorrow, do have a listen to our webinar on hedgerow trees, on hedges tomorrow and the future of hedges. And check out the one we did earlier in the week with the academics, which was really interesting about the cutting future of hedgerows in terms of science and research. Thank you all for your time today. Thank you for joining us, and happy National Hedgerow Week.